Thanks again for joining. We will now move forward in our program and have our next very interesting talk and short presentation. Before we do that, I would like to remind you, please ask your questions and do so by go to your email inbox and find the email with the subject link to questions/survey page. And there you will find a link to the Slido webpage where you can ask your questions. So, and with that, we have our next talk on Introduction, European Initiatives to Promote the Event Industry. Our speaker will be Randall Greenlee. He's Director of Commerce and International Affairs at the VPLT, the German Entertainment Technology Association. Randall, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Yes, I'd like to say hello to everybody that's online today. Thank you for taking part in our online conference. And after that wonderful keynote address from Mark Brown and also from Chris about the ideas that we have in competence and recognition, I'd like to talk a little bit about the event industry today and the European initiatives that are now on board to promote us. But of course, the first question is, what is the event industry? That's a very difficult question, as we found out in the pandemic, because it's very heterogenic and it's made up of a lot of very different market segments. Among other things, we have corporate events, and then we also have cultural events. And in the area of cultural events, we have private funded cultural events, and we also have lots of cultural events that are, of course, publicly funded by the member states in the European Union. Then we also have social events, and of course, a very big area, sports events. If we take a look at corporate events, then we have sub-markets within those as well that are very different. For example, we have meetings or training events in the corporate event section. We also have assemblies, things like annual general meetings, big corporations, but also in the area of unions when workers meet to make decisions within the company. So that's another area of the event industry that is very different than perhaps product presentations and roadshows or promotional activities that companies do. In some literature, you'll find that the terminology marketing events, because basically companies use events to market their products and services. And then there's a very, very big part of the corporate event market segment that has to do with trade shows, congresses, and conventions. Very big, for example, in Germany, because it's one of the biggest places where we have an awful lot of trade shows are in Germany, take place in Germany, but of course also in other countries in Europe. And if we look at cultural events, then it's very diverse as well. We have concerts, we have festivals. That's one of the things that is really hurting at the moment due to the pandemic, is the fact that we're not being able to produce any festivals, greenfield festivals, as we normally do in the summers in Europe. And as I said, we always need to remember some of these things are publicly funded and some of them are privately funded. Then we have the small area of comedy, cabaret. The Germans say Kleinkunst. In other words, small performances done usually in smaller venues. And then there are big folks festivals, but also fairs that take place for the general public. These can be private or publicly funded. And then we have, of course, the huge area of theater, whether it's musical theater, opera, or musicals, or operetta. And then we also have, of course, media productions that are done with live audiences, because television productions that are live and have live audiences are events just as well. And we also have things like readings for the book market. So a very diverse part of the event industry within the cultural segment. And then the social event segment also has different segments within itself. The benefits tournaments, which are used to raise funding as a sport event. Then there are fundraising events that take place for all types of organizations, whether they be pro bono, in other words, working maybe for UNICEF or something like that, or even for political parties. And then we have the typical life cycle events, anniversaries, and weddings. And we also have civic events, in other words, events that cities or perhaps even states within the member states, the federal states, where they're doing some sort of event. And of course, with the sports events, everyone knows professional sports, big theme at the moment, the breakaway group doing a super league, and amateur sports as well, as far as reaching out to amateur sports people, a very big area of the event industry, and the international, of course, sport industry. So we have a very heterogenic market, very difficult to deal with. And what has been done? Basically, if you take a look at what the EU did in the pandemic, they spent a lot of money, about 3.7 trillion. A trillion is a 1 with 12 zeros. So a lot of money was put up on the table to try to help everyone. This is not just the event industry, but everyone in the European Union that was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have 524 billion for national measures to help the budgets of the member states. Another 100 billion were spent for short-time work schemes. About 70 billion in direct support for budgets of the member states. Then 2.553 billion that was spent on national liquidity measures. In other words, to keep the countries in liquidity as far as spending is concerned, and another 240 billion went to the European Stability Mechanism, and 200 billion to the Investment Bank Fund, which is basically for the financing of loans to help companies get back out of the crisis. If we look even further, then we can see some specific support that was done, among other things, under the Article 1072B of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. Very important. In that treaty, at 172B, you see natural disasters and exceptional occurrences. And I think the pandemic was certainly that. And due to this part of the treaty, it was possible for the DG Competition, in other words, the Director General of Competition, to set up in the temporary framework measures that would help specifically due to problems caused by this natural disaster. And the compensation schemes that some examples are, for example, cancellation of events related to COVID-19 for Denmark. Big festivals that had to be canceled, they got special funding. There were also support measures, of course, for the Congress and Fair industry. One came from Italy, another one came from Germany. So there were some very specific things that the European Union did in our sector to help specific problems that arose. If we go even further into the question of support, there's another article, of course, in the Treaty for the Functioning of the EU, where there is compensation available under 107.3b. Now, that's an important project of common European interest that's has problems, or in order to remedy a serious disturbance in the economy. So this is another thing that came from the treaty. And in the temporary framework, there were possibilities for direct grants, for state guarantees for loans, for subsidized public loans to companies, deferral of tax payments and Social Security contributions. There was also targeted support for wage subsidies for employees, and also support for uncovered costs. So here the EU also opened up funding for these areas. They, of course, within the temporary framework, there always had to be an application done by the member states themselves in order to get this funding. But there was other specific support as well through the general block exemption regulation in Article 53, cultural services. Now we're looking at one mark segment. Cultural services could get exemption from the notification requirements within the temporary framework, and also get investment aid, especially in the area of costs. The difference between the eligible costs within the program and operating profit it could be deferred in the sense that up to 150 million, even cultural institutions could make a profit within the pandemic. There was also some aid to help operating costs in the differences between losses and what the cultural institutions had to give out, and that was up to 75 million a year. And of course, anything under 2 million is possible in the cultural area of the general block exemption regulation, up to 2 million, 80% of costs that are eligible within the program. So there were programs already in place before the pandemic came that did help the cultural sector. And another specific thing in the cultural sector would be that support can be given that's not even regarded as state aid. And among those things are cultural activities that are accessible to the general public. In other words, nothing that's really privately closed, in other words, just to make money, but the public is open to attend these cultural events. Anything that's predominantly financed by the state, over 50%, is also eligible for this type of funding. And of course, unique cultural conservation activities, something that's very specific, another thing that comes in the Horizon Europe program as well. The general measures benefiting all types of undertakings within the cultural sector. And if there's no effect on trade, that's one of the big issues in the European Union, is the question of competition and trade. Well, then up to 200,000 euros could be given over a 3-year period anyway. And usually the EU looks at it to see if there's nothing that would attract customers from another member state. In other words, we're talking about local cultural activities, then these things can also get special funding. So we did have a lot of specific support, but at the same time, the European Union has been moving forward with legislation and initiatives that do very indirectly, not directly, but indirectly have effects on our industry. One of the things is a directive on transparent and predictable working conditions within the EU, because this will make sure that workers have new rights in their situation as being an employer, also in the event industry. Among other things, there are new regulations in regard to information on the essential aspects of the work people are doing, then limits to the length of a probationary period. In other words, typical is maybe a 3-month period where you have to show, okay, I'm capable of doing the job, but you won't be able to extend that to 12 months or something like that, because that's just not proper. Another thing, the right to seek additional employment if you're only part-time, that you can say, I would like to have more hours. Another thing, notification when work will take place, exactly when do you have to be at your working job. These have some very big implications for the event industry. And also anti-abuse legislation in regard to zero contract working. This is something that's you see a lot in the service industry, where people are not even guaranteed a certain amount of numbers. In other words, it could be that in 1 month they have zero work. So there's legislation now being made to make sure that isn't abused. Then, of course, a written reply in case an employer has a request to employee has a request for a more secure job, then the employer has to have a written reply saying why that's not possible. And now for our area, as I was saying, very important, this question of cost-free mandatory training. We're talking today about vocational educational training. This will be across the board for all member states in the EU, then free for all employees, and the employers will have to have these programs in place. So looking even further, there are other proposals in regard to adequate minimum wages, also to pay transparency measures. This is very important because, as we know, the gender equality has not been reached. Women still earn less than men, also in the event industry, and this is something the EU wants to change. And once again, Mark Brown talked about this as well, the European Skills Agenda, very important for us because it should strengthen sustainability, in other words, competitiveness also in making it resilient and long-term. It's also supposed to ensure social fairness, and it should also, resilience should be in place. In other words, if we have another pandemic or some sort of disaster happen, we should be able to rebound much faster. If we take a quick look at the European Skills Agenda, it's basically 4 building blocks. We have collective action for the Pact for Skills. In other words, everyone needs to be on board, stakeholders like our association, but also vocational educational institutions. Then the right skills for the right job. In other words, there is a big focus on vocational educational training, but of course also science. This areas, the STEM curricula is very important, but also entrepreneurship is supposed to be brought along with this. So our ideas within TEBIFAT of talking about assessment of skills, knowing exactly what the right skills for the right job is definitely the right way. And of course, pathways to lifelong learning. We'll have today someone from Europass, from the European Commission there as well, talking about how we might be able to create some sort of individual learning accounts that are lifelong, that people keep their entire vocational career. And of course, also a framework to unlock investments. In other words, the EU is seen, it's not just going to be public funding, it's going to be private funding as well that we will need. So another thing that has to do with today's program as well as Erasmus Plus program, of course. The budget has been increased for 2020 from 2021 to 2027 to 26.2 billion euros. That's an increase of 178%. So it will be more inclusive, more digital, more green if you look at the programs. So these things are also there in place to help the event industry in working towards better vocational educational training. And we also have Horizon Europe, a new program that has 95.5 billion euros in its funding. And one of the clusters is culture, creativity, and inclusive society. So the event industry will have possibilities there to get funding to do some scientific studies, but also to take a look at vocational educational training and how we might make that better. There are synergies as well with Creative Europe. That's the big culture program for the culture and creative sectors in Europe from 21 to 27. That's 2.4 billion that will be available for that. And of course, we also have some synergies with the Digital Europe program because the idea that events in the future will also be hybrid, I think that's very clear that that will be the case. I'd like to talk about Pearl quickly. We have Anita de Beer at the end of the day in the last roundtable. She's the managing director of Pearl, Live Performance Europe. That is a good representation of interest within the cultural sector. They're responsible for performing arts and live performance organizations. In other words, the employers and also the unions that are working within our sector in the cultural area. That's why they're also involved with social dialogue. In other words, getting the unions and the employers together, talking about what topics are most important. They also have a good project called Behind the Stage. You can check that on their website, where they're looking into the industry to see what skills, also how the future of the industry looks for the people who are working within it. And of course, they're also very involved in European legislation. Among other things at the moment that they're doing, mobility issues, posting of workers. We all know the event industry is international. We move across borders quickly. Workers have to be able to move across borders. So posting, which is another legislative directive of the EU, is very important for our sector. Then social security coordination measures. We all want to have our social security also work when we're working outside of the country where our program is based. So those are good and very important topics. And also a new pact on migration and asylum, very important for the question of what will happen after the pandemic. It's sure that we'll have more migration, and we need to talk about this issue as well. There's a study at the moment called Mobile Live about the mobility within our sector that is being done by Pearl. And of course, they are also involved in Erasmus Plus projects, Garden and Slack. Garden is about developing training, sustainability, but also digital formats within the event industry. And Slack is a study about methodology. In other words, what types of skills do we really need in the sector? And Pearl is very strong on gender equality, working towards that goal of the EU. And as well, they also have a job platform so that people can find jobs within the industry simply by accessing the Pearl website. If we look at other European representations of interest within the event industry, we have to say there are several national organizations, but almost no international organizations that really funnel and focus what the event industry needs in the market of corporate events. That's something we'll be working on in the next years to make sure that also in this area of the market, there's more voices available. But one quick outlook, and I'm at the end of my presentation. The Green Deal also has something to do with us. We have to look towards sustainability. In other words, the circular economy within the EU. This is going to be one of our biggest challenges. And if we take a look at that, the major issues are the Circular Economy Action Plan of the EU and the Sustainable Products Initiative. In other words, our products will have to be sustainable. Everything we do, we will have to define what our product environmental footprint is. Lighting instruments, all types of equipment that we use need to be sustainable and long-term. They need to be able to be repaired, for example. But we also have to talk about our service companies and the organizational environmental footprint. And this is a big issue for greenfield festivals, for festivals, touring companies. These are things that the industry is now looking into because we have to provide the EU with the data. And of course, the European Skills Agenda, as we said before, Mark Brown also spoke about this, is a part of the Green Deal. In other words, moving forward with skills, and the European Pillar of Social Rights. So there's lots on the table for the event industry coming up, and there's lots of initiatives coming from the EU. The stakeholders in the industry, such as our association and also the other ones that are involved in the TEBIFAT project, are all going to be very much involved, and I hope everyone in the industry in responding to these initiatives that the EU now has on the table so that we can move forward after the pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Stephanie, and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Randall, for that excellent overview. It seems like there's a lot going on in Europe, which is good to see, and there's also a lot of budget involved, so it's definitely an important topic. In the matter of time, we will need to move on to directly to our next speaker, and maybe we have some time for the questions afterwards.